Jin Yucheng's novel Flowers Text Chapter 14. 1. After the luncheon, Mr. Kang accompanied the three bosses and rushed to Kunshan to discuss business. Kang Tai led the women and wives, a group of 4 people, and a commercial car, to waiting Asadin for consumption. Each person had a big or small foreskin, and Kang Tai paid the bill, and then went to the Hilton for afternoon tea. Which seats for? Gu Tai spoke northern dialect. Miss Khan from Shanghai is Mr. Hong. Mrs. Hong. Why didn't we meet at noon? Mrs. King spoke northern dialect. This woman. Something is not right recently. I'm talking behind her back. Miss Wang does not want to accompany her husband to socialize, and says she wants to find a different way of living. Mrs. Liu talked about the northern saying, Shanghai women, maid. Gu Tai said, our Kang Tai is virtuous, but we are really not like Shanghai women. Kang Tai apologized and said with a smile, I have a lot of housework. Gu Tai said, by the way, Kang Tai, you should go back first. You have been with us for most of the day. We can handle dinner ourselves. It's okay. When Kang Tai saw this, he was polite, took out an envelope, put it on the coffee table and said, it's a small thing, please feel free to spend it. The 3 ladies said a few polite words, stood up to express their thanks, and watched Kang Tai leave. At this moment, Mrs. Gu immediately called Ms. Wang and chatted for a few words. Half an hour later, Miss Wang crept in and sat down to chat. Gu Tai spoke the northern dialect. I haven't seen you for a long time and you are more energetic. Miss Wang spoke the northern dialect, and it was only then that I realized that the spirit of what northerners talk about is beauty. Mrs. Gu said, let me introduce this person to Mrs. Lin from Taiwan. Miss Wang smiled. Gu Tai said that we have to learn from the recent situation in Shanghai against the movement against husbands and wives accompanying each other. Miss Wang laughed and said that Kang must be too talkative. Gu Tai said that it really didn't matter whether a man took his wife with him or not, but the wife dumped her husband and went out alone, unless it was a class reunion. Mrs. Liu spoke northern dialect, and there were some sensual scenes, which were really inconvenient. As for the sisterhood, she was thinking about home. Speaking in Mandarin, Mrs. Lin said that it is natural for couples to come out to socialize. Miss Wang said, what's wrong with you guys? Can you tell me something else? Gu Tai said, we must not learn from Shanghai's reform experience and communicate with each other, right? Lin Taexiao said that when mainlanders meet and talk about exchanges, the question they ask me is independence or reunification, blue or green. Miss Wang fiddled with her hair and said, what is the meaning of politics? What women want is love, fate, mood and environment. Gu Tai said, I like to hear this. Ms. Wang said that more than a month ago, I went to Changshu with some hot women from Shanghai. As a result, I got entangled with an old-school Shanghai man. It was exciting. In the end, although we broke up unhappy, despite being hated by others, I have gained a good memory and knowledge. Mrs. Liu said, it sounded like jealousy. Ms. Wang said that it is difficult to be a woman. How to dress up when you go out with your husband is not a problem, but if you go out by yourself and dress up in the same way, there is a problem. In Shanghai dialect, you are a vixen or a slut. Gu Tai said, vixens are common throughout the country, but what happens if you get entangled with an old man? Anyway, if you are like this, according to us, it is called owing. Miss Wang said with a smile, just say whatever you want. Mrs. Lin said that this story is very unusual. Ms. Wang said, average. Gu Tai said, old school men. Are they very cold in that regard? Mrs. Liu said, do you have a family? Miss Wang said, look, I didn't drink a sip of tea. Where is the inquiry record? Gu Tai offered tea and said, come on, moisten your throat first and speak slowly. Ms. Wang said that it was actually nothing, but that the mood was really strong and the atmosphere was rare. The 3 ladies looked at Miss Wang and were very curious. At this moment, Miss Wang thought for a while and said, I'll make a call first. Miss Wang walked to the lobby, talked on the phone, and came in to sit down. Gu Tai said, it's really appetizing. Miss Wang said, the old man I just mentioned happened to be in Shanghai recently. How about we make an appointment with him to have dinner at Jizanuan in the evening? Gu Tai said, this is okay. Miss Wang said, I just made an appointment. Gu Tai nodded and said, Okay, Mrs. Lu said. Let's continue with the sentiment we just mentioned. Miss Wang smiled and said, I'm ashamed to say that I was almost drunk when I first arrived in Changshu. I woke up in the afternoon and was lying on a bed with a carved tent. I got up lazily. The old-fashioned man had already brought a teacup over, play records, prepare bath water, be considerate and considerate. Finally, the two of them went to the window and sat side by side. Next to them was a chiming clock, an elegant coffee table, and fine sandalwood drifting from the antique incense. The old schoolman changed a few old records, and the gramophone turned slowly, and there was a song singing. I'm waiting for you to come back. I'm thinking about you coming back. Waiting for you to come back. Makes me happy. Why don't you come back? I have to wait for you to come back. If you don't come back, the beauty will be gone. Mrs. Lin said, Well, by Guang's old songs. Miss Wang said, sitting in front of the window and looking down. She saw the ridge of the green tile roof, the private patio in the middle, and a small stage in the east, where people were playing and singing, revealing a pair of petite embroidered gold lotuses, a pair of black-faced cloth shoes with round mouths, and white socks in the west. In the quarter, there were many women who had come with them, and they had all kinds of shoes. When the old schoolman opened the flower window, a Suzhou tune came up, translated into northern dialect, that is, returning to the house, supporting the maid Cheng Xiang, lying on the gums with endless regrets. From then on, the allele meridian turns hundreds of times on the day, and the appearance in the rhombus mirror is damaged. The three ladies were silent. Miss Wang said, Could it be possible that an important leader in the north has passed away, and the solemnity has become like this? Mrs. Lin said, The atmosphere is very good. I thought that drinking a Parisian coffee, watching the sunset on the deck, and several stars on the grassland would be the atmosphere. The style of the wine is completely different. It is a woman's house, an old big bed. I wake up lazily, and my face is like the peach blossoms are delicate and weak. And the old gentleman is attentive to them, burning incense and bathing, singing strings under the window, and the autumn wind is mourning. 150 years ago, the third concubine of the governor of Liangjiang was nothing more than this. Gu Tai laughed and said, Ed. Ms. Wang said that life was ordinary, so she had to make it up. Mrs. Lu said that only Miss Wang could handle this, but who among us would dare? Gu Tai said, It's a different story when you're drunk. The old man in Shanghai did his best to be a landlord, cherishing the beauty and cherishing the jade, and making good fortune. In my area, there are usually fierce Zhang Faiduo, Ruan brothers, and Lu Zhishan. There are also many with extraordinary physical strength, both men and women. In between, that is, 1 push, 2, 6, and 5, a quick victory. Mrs. Lin said that Lu Zhishan was a man who uprooted weeping willows and was not close to women. Mrs. Lu said that those who eat dog meat can be called editors of water margin, as long as they are not sexually attracted to women. Gu Tai said that the last time my husband and I came to Shanghai, the client invited us to a nightclub, and the men and women in the foreskin room were talking about the best men and top women, so I left. In fact, I didn't understand what the best was. Mrs. Lu said that they must be young. Women should not be more than 20, and men should not be more than 28. Gu Tai said, It's vulgar. You also use yin to replenish yang. As for Indian sacred oil, I'm talking about realm and style. Mrs. Lin said that the men and women in this story are the best in Shanghai. I have a Taiwanese friend who wrote a negative article, thinking that the men and women in Shanghai have been deformed. Gu Tai said, I remember reading this article. When Shanghai men get up early, they either empty the spittoon, wash their wife's underwear, and buy back a hairtail fish. Lin Taxiao said that it was indeed written in this way, which attracted Shanghai literati to collectively attack, thinking that it was distortion and smearing Shanghai men. It was a lively moment. Friends collected these words, paired them with her original text, and published a book. I gave a copy to Mr. Bo in Shanghai at that time. He was very understanding, and he was the only one who understood the meaning of this book and gave dry smiles. Miss Wang said, Mr. Bao, it can't be a Bao, my friend. Mrs. Lin said, Yes. Mr. Bao has a good eye. He knows that this article seems to be ridiculing men, but it is actually considering whether women will be restrained after they have full freedom. Should they maintain the characteristics of traditional women and top women, or continue to do so? Upward, and finally lawless, because when women change, the men around them also change. After decades of equal rights for men and women, equal pay for equal work, half-a-day education, female traders in the market dare to skin quails alive, kill rabbits, kill pigs, kill cow. A woman kills a donkey. Because women of the previous generation also made steel and iron, built mountains and built roads as masons, and drove giant buses. They inherited the independent view of historical genes coupled with economic status, regardless of how much they make. They inflated their self-confidence. So-called spiritual independence is for sure. Even if you don't have a beard on the outside, have great body measurements, and wear famous brand lipstick every day, you are slowly becoming masculine on the inside. It is inevitable that the men around you will not gradually become feminized, and one will wax and wane. At that time, Bo always felt that, since men are like stones, a woman's powerful strength should be soft moves and slow skills. Do you understand? The surface is weak as water, but nothing in the world is as good as water, Gu Tai said. What do you mean? Mrs. Lin said that the water surface is the calmest. It was said in the Chinese language class that the fine details are the snails, the spirals are the tiger's eyes, and the notes are Tiangkun. The standing is Yu, the arrogance is the dragon, the spray is the mist, breathing it becomes wind, anger becomes thunder. Mrs. Lu said, No, 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 no. Flash floods are breaking out. It's crazy. It's even scarier. It's what Shanghai people call a tiger, Mrs. Lin said. It's mainly due to the softness. When the water rises, there is no sound at all. The water pipe upstairs is broken. When I wake up in the morning, the water has risen to the top of my feet. Does the water make any sound? It's a secret slow skill, Mr. Bao said. It's like a drop of water can penetrate a stone. It's amazing. This is the nature of women, the most gentle and quiet. If men and women are both hard rocks, if the two rocks collide, sparks will fly everywhere. Mrs. Lu smiled, but Miss Wang remained silent. Gu Tai said, It makes sense. Mrs. Lin said that water is the powerful force of women without knowing it. Stones are not aware of it at all, and they are finally ground into pebbles. This exquisite water grinding skill can make stubborn stones nod. Mrs. Lu gasped. Ancient Tai said, Be taught. At this moment, Miss Wang murmured that Mrs. Lin actually knew a Bao. Mrs. Lin said that after living in Hongqiao for 5 years, her husband and I went to work in the north. What happened? Miss Wang said, The world is too small. I regret telling that story. We have stopped here. There will be trouble if word spreads. Mrs. Lin said, Don't worry. Even if I saw a Bao today, I didn't say a word. And he hasn't been seen for 4 or 5 years. Gu Tai patted the envelope and said, Why don't you call now and invite us to come and get together tonight? We'll pay the bill, old school Shanghai man plus Mr. Bao. This is a good idea. Miss Wang said nothing. Mrs. Lin said, Is it okay? Mrs. Lu said, Call Mr. Bao quickly. Miss Wang said, This is it. Lin Tai said shyly, Then I will fight. Mrs. Lin called a Bao and spoke in Shanghai's. Mr. Bao, guess who I am? People immediately started laughing. The two parties immediately agreed that a Bao would go directly to the Jijin garden to meet for dinner. Mrs. Lin hung up the phone. Gu Tai said that when she talks to her old lover, she becomes so coquettish. Mrs. Lin said that he could easily guess my pidgin Shanghai's, so I laughed. Mrs. Lu said that it was quite hidden. It turned out that there was a man named Bao in Shanghai. Mrs. Lin wanted to defend herself. Miss Wang slowly stood up and said, I forgot one thing. I will go there first and then come back. Gu Tai said, What's wrong? Miss Wang said, Come as soon as you go. Gu Tai grabbed him and said, Don't worry, Bao Zong is coming. I feel bad. We don't know anything, so don't worry. Miss Wang said, What am I afraid of? A Bao was my client before and has been my friend for many years. Gu Tai said, If you have something to do, let's talk about it later. What time will it be? Miss Wang could only sit down. That evening, a Bao came to the lobby of Jizinuan and the foreman said that the landlady was out. A Bao followed the waiter into the foreskin room. In the back room, sitting alone, was Mr. Zhu from Changshu. Their eyes met, and the two of them were stunned. A Bao said, "I made a mistake." Or Mr. Zhu recognized Mrs. Lin. Mr. Zhu said, "I answered the call from Miss Wang. There are 3 foreign ladies coming to Shanghai. It should be correct. I am the only one who made a reservation with the surname Zhu." A Bao sat down. Mr. Zhu said, "I know, Mr. Bao doesn't want to meet me anymore," A Bao said. "What's the point of talking nonsense? I'm busy. I should return the invitation. I must thank Changshu for the warm reception last time." Mr. Zhu said, "I drank a little too much this time in Changshu. I'm sorry. Boss Ding told me about the book project." Mr. Bao was very helpful. He had a road and a shoulder. I couldn't thank him enough. The waiter pours tea. Mr. Zhu whispered, "To be honest, only men can be my confidants and understand me." A Bao smiled. Mr. Zhu said that in front of women, I usually act as a ferry boat. When a woman gets on the boat, I row to the east or west. When the place is reached, the woman gets off the boat. Only a boyfriend can last forever. A Bao said that when women get on the boat, most of them refuse to get off and are ready to rock the couple's boat. Mr. Zhu lowered his voice and said, "The women I want will never get on the boat. I don't want the women who get on the boat." For example, Lily squatted on the bridge of the river, looking round, pretending to be stupid. "What can I do?" A Bao didn't make any sound. Mr. Zhu said that when a boat forgets to capsize, it is easy to get dizzy. If the woman on board does something wrong, the ferry may change its route and change the cargo to load potatoes and catch fish and snails. The waterway is also poor and the waves are high. Two people have more opinions than one. One wants the east, the other wants the west. I have to pack cotton. I have to pack yellow sand, gravel and eggs. I'm annoyed and miserable, and my waist and back hurt. In the end, the boat deck leaks and the waves come up. There is no good result, A Bao said. Sad is a little sad. Mr. Zhu said, "No wonder the boat capsized several times." A Bao smiled. Mr. Zhu said that Mr. Bao still understands the classics and adheres to the basic principles unwaveringly. Until now, he has remained a boy. A Bao laughed and said, "Once a person reaches the age of 30, there will be no boys or girls." Mr. Zhu said, "This is a good sentence." At this point, the waiter ushered in Miss Wang, Mrs. Gu, Mrs. Liu, and Mrs. Lin. The room was immediately filled with aroma, and after some pleasantries and introductions, Miss Wang arranged a seat. Mrs. Gu took the seat. Then Mr. Zhu from Changshu, Miss Wang opposite Mrs. Liu, Mrs. Lin, and A Bao, leaving a seat for the proprietress Lily at the door, with side dishes come up. Mrs. Gu and Mrs. Liu looked relaxed on the surface. They looked at Mr. Zhu with black eyes. Mr. Zhu always had a habit of dragging the chair closer to him when he met a strange female guest. This time, Miss Wang probably had to hold the legs of the stool tightly and could only keep it in place. When Miss Wang approached, Mr. Zhu was relatively cold. Mrs. Lin on the other side looked at Mr. Zhu for a moment, smiled slightly, and turned to reminisce with A Bao. Gutai spoke northern dialect. "The two bosses came here despite their busy schedules. I want to pay my respects first." So the three of them drank wine. Mr. Zhu speaks northern dialect. "If it weren't for the three beauties coming to Shanghai, I would still be sitting in the office and eating rice bowls." Miss Khan smiled and served Mr. Zhu some food. Mr. Zhu stepped aside and said, "Miss Khan, you are too close." Miss Khan rolled her eyes at Mr. Zhu. Mr. Zhu said, "I first respect the beauties around me." Gutai did not shy away and toasted with Mr. Zhu. With a smile on her face, she said, "Nowadays, beauties are everywhere, and I can't feel any electricity at all." Mr. Zhu took the waiter's bottle of red wine and filled it up for Mrs. Gu. Miss Khan said that in northern dialect, this is called to dragons playing with pearls, with beards empty versus beards empty. Today, we are allowed to compliment each other, and we can be shameless. Lin Taxiao said, "This sentence is great. I have written it down." Gutai said, "We three sisters, and two handsome guys. Let's have a good time." The three ladies were so beautiful that one of them left after 5 wine glasses were touched. Mr. Zhu said that drinking with northern women will bring you to a higher level. Gutai said, I have always felt that Shanghai's people are stingy, and the dishes are too small. They only use 3 ounces of chopsticks, and a dish is gone. The same is true in Suzhou, with a small bowl of lotus seed soup and a small cup of rock sugar bird's nest. Now the dishes in the north are gradually reduced in volume, which is called refinement. Mrs. Lu said, my father-in-law, who was an old Shanghai's, eats a small moon cake and cuts it into 4 small pieces. You cannot bite the moon cake directly. Miss Wang said she had never heard of it. Mrs. Lu said that the Tangu eats the moon and bites it directly. Everyone laughed. Mrs. Lin said, I grew up in a military community, where people from Hebei and northeast China lived together. What Shanghai people couldn't stand the most was the Cantonese people eating shark's fin rice. The ingredients were so good. So why did everyone eat so little in a big bowl? Snoring, Mrs. Lu said, I remember that the first time I came back here, I made a mistake, which was embarrassing. Gutai said that she and the pretty boy from Shikumen in Shanghai made a private promise for life in the alley. Ms. Wang said that Mrs. Lu was too watery and had a first-class turnaround rate. Mrs. Lu said, I don't understand. At the onion and ginger stall in Shanghai, 3 spring onions are sold for 1 penny. In my hometown, green onions are sold in bundles. When I went to a classmate's house in Shanghai, I saw 3 spring onions on the chopping board and ate them casually. As a result, my aunt and I couldn't find any green onions when I was cooking fish, so I got very angry. I just learned that people in Shanghai only buy onions for cooking fish and don't eat them at all. Mr. Zhu said, our discussion meeting is over. The 3 beauties just talked and didn't drink. I'll give you a toast. Miss Wang said calmly that after drinking, she at least wanted to think about how the 3 beauties came here. Gutai said, oh damn it, I forgot to offer a toast to Sister Wang. I'm sorry, I'll do it first. Miss Wang said, Mr. Zhu can't drink anymore, otherwise something will happen if he drinks anymore. Why are we, Mrs. Lin, here, even if we haven't seen Mr. Bao for more than 40 years? It's understandable that we are anxious, and we have to take care of him. Other people's emotions are not. Lin Taexiao said, how about I ask Mr. Bao, the representative, to have a drink with Miss Wang? Miss Wang said, I haven't touched a drop of wine, and you all drink like roses. Mr. Bao and I have nothing to drink. Mrs. Lu said that Mr. Bao was currently under the severe influence of Mrs. Lin. The topic of men, women, and stones rubbing against water was not used at all. So, it would be better to sit apart from each other. Mr. Zhu and Mr. Bao, how about changing seats? A Bao smiled and said, okay. Mr. Zhu wanted to stand up, but the back of his clothes seemed to be tightly hooked, making him unsteady for a moment. Mrs. Lin hurriedly waved her hand and said, I don't agree to change. A Bao said, what's wrong? Mr. Zhu is so scary. Mrs. Lin came closer to A Bao and whispered, I was scared. If Mr. Zhu sat over, the jealousy jar next to him would be overturned. Later, A Bao learned that in the afternoon of that day, Lily was out doing errands and had her hair and nails done at 4:30. Suddenly, she received a call from the hotel foreman, saying that Mr. Zhu, Mr. Bao, Miss Wang and others were going to come to the restaurant for dinner. Lily said, got it. After hanging up the phone, Lily ducked into the corridor of the beauty salon, hesitated for a moment, and dialed Su-In's number. Lily said, I am almost like a secret agent. Su-In said, thank you for your help. What a coincidence. I will go to the hotel tonight. Lily said, something will happen. Su-In said, don't worry. It's not my style to ask me to lead people to fight Miss Wang. If I want to take action, I won't choose just a new one. Lily said that it was unlikely that the feud had reached this point. Miss Wang was a pretty decent person. Su-In said, I already told you yesterday about the specific situation. How could Lily understand the specific situation? Mr. Zhu, PepsiCo didn't care. I went to Shanghai to look for Miss Wang, but 120 people ignored her, didn't meet, and didn't make any sound. Lily said that if you have any matters, you can go to Ms. Wang's company to discuss it. Suin said that I would not go to a place where there is no love or righteousness. When I go to a restaurant at night, I just have a glass of wine with Mr. Zhu and Miss Wang. And smile. That's fine. Lily said, if there is any matter, discuss it carefully and don't get angry. Suin said, don't worry, I will definitely smile. Lily hung up the phone and returned to the mirror. Suddenly, she felt that the appearance of her hair was not pleasing to her eyes. She complained to the barber that it was not good either way. At nearly 8 o'clock, Lily rushed to the Jishan garden. Before entering the foreskin room, he calmed down for a moment, and then stepped in with a spring breeze on his face. On the table, Mr. Zhu and his wives were already drunk, and everyone smiled at Lily. Ms. Wang stood up and introduced. The waiter poured the wine. Lily talks about the north. By the way, ladies and gentlemen, I am rude for coming here. Thank you, Miss Wang, for giving me face. Everyone laughed and had a drink. Mrs. Liu said that we have been drinking until now, and Mr. Bo has met with Taiwanese fans. He only wants to engage in activities alone and is not very interested. I suggest that Mr. Bao at least tell the romantic story of meeting Mrs. Lin. Mrs. Lin said, no. Miss Wang said, I like to hear romantic stories. Lin Tairan said, it's super exaggerated. Where is the romance? A group of people went to the northwest to discuss a planning project and plant trees by the way. I went with my husband, and in Shanghai, it was Mr. Bao and other people. And everyone interacted like this. Yeah, I felt tired and cold, so I came back. Bao said that it was only a week, and Mr. Lin Talon was a little frightened, but nothing serious happened. Mrs. Lin said she wouldn't talk anymore. Bao said, I won't tell. Gutai laughed and said, tell it carefully, speak in general terms. No one likes to listen. Especially in such desolate places, women in civilized society like to hear colonial stories, desolate stories, and thrilling sea stories. Only such stories will lead to barbarism. True feelings, Miss Wang said. Let's talk. Lily smiled and said, speak. Bao said that there is a section of road with desert on both sides. Mrs. Lin said, I won't talk anymore, I'm too shy. Bao said that the driver introduced that this was a gold mining land in the Qing dynasty. Mrs. Lin said, still not talking. Mrs. Liu said, don't interrupt. Bao smiled and said that the driver chanted sutras all the way. After a while, the car went uphill and the stopwatch stepped on 70, and the maximum speed was 20. Mr. Zhu said, the devil is beating the wall. Bao said that the car made a strange noise, suddenly shook, and many rocks rolled down the slope. When the big light was illuminated, they were all dead people and skeletons. Gutai said, it's over, the party to enjoy the cool air has begun. Bao said that it was probably due to weathering, and the old tombs were exposed layer by layer. Mrs. Lin hid her face and said, no more talking. It's so ugly, I don't want to hear it anymore. Bao said that when the car turned a corner, 3 tires blew out. The driver could only replace the spare tires. He took me to the top of the slope. Looking from a distance into the moon, there was a group of ragged men, who seemed to be sitting on the ground to rest and eat. The moonlight is yellow, and the hair is golden. The driver whispered, this group is the dead ghosts who mined gold in the past. And they are causing trouble tonight, so they should cut out quickly. The driver kowtowed for more than a dozen times and prayed, asking the golden immortal to come and burn the paper next month. The immortal will bless him and keep him safe. I looked up and saw the moonlight in front of me. The figure of the dead ghost suddenly faded and finally disappeared. When we returned to the car, Mrs. Lin was crying in the car. Mrs. Lin said that Mr. Bao was exaggerating and it was too embarrassing. Stop talking about it. Bao said that everyone was shocked. Mrs. Lin's husband was foaming at the mouth and convulsing all over. The driver and I immediately pulled Mrs. Lin out. The driver said, "Count out quickly." Mrs. Lin cried so hard that she couldn't breathe. Mrs. Lin said, "Nonsense." Bao said that the three of us kowtowed to the golden immortal on the spot. At that time, Mrs. Lin kowtowed more than 30 times at one go. In the end, she fell to the ground and couldn't hold her back. Lin Tai said shyly that she was in a hurry, and what else could she think of? What she hated was that she was wearing a skirt and was almost naked. Mr. Zhu said that even if everything is revealed, she is still a virtuous woman. Bao said that Mr. Lin woke up slowly. The driver looked at the front wheel and saw that there was still some air. Everyone got in the car and ran. The accelerator started to feel 70 is 70, and 100 is 100. Gu Tai said, "What's next?" Bao said that the next step was to repair the car, accompany Mr. Lin to see a doctor, return to the hotel, and say goodbye the next day. Lu Taxiao said, "Really, there are no tidbits. This night, Mrs. Lin needs comfort. She knocks on the door and comes in at midnight. There is always something to talk about." Lin Taxiao said, "The two sisters are so shameless. At this time, even if I have any thoughts, I will still feel guilty. Besides, I'm a woman who will always be loyal." I gave the driver a sum of money to do the memorial service on my behalf. Bao said, "This is what it should be." Having said this, Mrs. Lin clasped her hands together, closed her eyes, and murmured, "I believe in the golden immortal of the West. The golden immortal will bless me and everyone." Everyone is silent. Miss Wang said, "I really can't stand it when this happens." Gu Tai said, "Indeed." Mr. Zhu said that if you can't keep knocking, your husband will be hard to save. Gu Tai said, "It's just a talk. For my husband, I will definitely give in the end." Bao laughed and said, "I can't knock it down, and even a whole car of people won't agree." Mr. Zhu said with a smile that he had to knock the cow's head down to drink water. Everyone is silent. At this moment, Bao noticed that Li Lixin had a new hairstyle, and his expression was very unnatural and nervous. Suddenly, the door of the foreskin room opened, and there was a small breeze, and a person came in. Li didn't move. Mr. Zhu and Miss Wang suddenly changed their colors. Suan walked into the foreskin room. Bao got up and said hello, Suan. Li turned around and said with a little embarrassment, "There are few customers. Waiter, please add chairs." Suan kept smiling and spoke in northern dialect. "Mr. Bao, please introduce the guests." Bao introduced the three ladies. Suan blocked Bao's wine glass and spoke Shanghai's. "Now that I can understand it, I am basically no longer an outsider. The reason why I came here today is because I have talked to Miss Wang many times. But all of them ignored me, did not meet, and did not respond. I just want to ask Miss Wang now. It has been 2 months since I came back from Changshu. Miss Wang, her breasts are a bit swollen, and the little girl in her belly is getting bigger day by day. May I ask Miss Wang, when will you prepare to arrive? I went to the Red House Hospital for an abortion. This little girl had to have an abortion."
Alright, this part of the story ends here.
Want to know what happened next? Let's listen to the breakdown next time.